as one of the ISB members who's been closely involved in our review of DMDU in the Delta, I have the privilege of introducing our speaker today. And this is our fourth seminar on decision-making under deep uncertainty in the Delta that the ISB has hosted. And this is part of our broader review that we're doing on decision-making under deep uncertainty. And we're going to be using these seminars to inform this review and also hopefully provide some education for the listeners of our meeting here and maybe the broader public. The previous seminars are available on the website if you need to find them and look for them. They've covered things like introduction to deep uncertainty and tools for making decisions under uncertainty and cognitive biases. And so we've heard from some of these other speakers in the seminar series about the importance of including diverse stakeholders and different types of actors and knowledge sources, both in the development of scenarios and in the analysis of scenarios. But we haven't had a lot of in-depth discussion on how this might work in practice. So I'm really pleased to introduce Brett Milligan today, who's an associate professor of landscape architecture and environmental design with the Department of Human Ecology at UC Davis. And he has some experience to share with us on this topic. So I'm going to pass it off to Brett and let him introduce his title for us, because I think it might have changed a little bit since I said, there it is, testing and making futures. So I'm going to pass it off to Brett, and after his presentation, we'll open it up for discussion. So take it away, Brett.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, just making sure I'm not muted. Thank you very much for the invitation to share a little bit about the work I do. Yeah, talk's called Testing and Making Futures, Participatory Scenario Planning in California's Delta. And what I was hoping to do in this half hour is, I mean, scenario planning is such a wide range of theory and practices, and there's different ways of doing it, as I think everyone's seen in the other presentations. And I'm just going to sort of situate where I think some of my work falls, and then really just get into like actual applications in the Delta to try to, what that actually might look like. So I would say let's hope the slides advance. There we go. Most of what I do, I would say, falls within a post-normal science paradigm. And if this term is new to you, I'll just say a little bit about what it means to me. Is a framework for applying science to issues where facts are uncertain, values in dispute, stakes high, and decisions urgent. And I think a central tenet of post-normal science is that it speaks to the fact that there are multiple legitimate truths in any kind of situation. It's sort of a pluralistic way of looking at the world and of situating knowledge, and how do we work from that point of view. And in that way, it attempts to democratize science through a more inclusive process of co-production, rather than it's less science for, but science with, perhaps. And in that way, it tries to expand peer review to all the people who are involved or who may be impacted by planning or science outcomes, and to help define what the real relevant questions are, or the ones that matter to broader publics. And so for me, one of the ways I try to pursue this is through participatory scenario planning. I think you've heard from the other speakers a bit about what scenario planning is, generally a structured method for envisioning and assessing multiple possible futures. The participatory part is really about, who is included in these processes. And I think that is sort of an area of expanding research in scenario planning of how and when are different, people included in a process, and how does that influence outcomes in the process itself. For me, most importantly, I see scenario planning as a collaborative and integrative process for co-learning. So I am as much as interested in the process of doing scenario planning, of going through it, as I am in the outcomes, in terms of sort of the social side of that and the potential building of capacity through shared knowledge. So that's sort of the positioning of my work. If none of that makes any sense, don't worry. I'm now just going to jump into what are some projects or ways that this might work in the Delta. And so I'm going to go through mainly this project called Frank's Track Futures, which is really concerned with climate change adaptation, and in particularly like how we manage increasing salinity in the Delta that comes along with a lot of climate change impacts, and sort of how we might look at scenarios for that. So Frank's Track Futures was a project that happened a few years back. And Frank's Tract is, and you see the red circle in there, it's basically this shallow lake in the center of the Delta. That's a view from it from Google Earth. This was a project led by California Department of Fish and Wildlife under a Prop 1 grant. And just to give you a little sense of how did Frank's Tract come to be what it is, it was marsh wetland prior to 1900s when it was reclaimed. With levees, and basically stayed reclaimed into the late 30s, where there was a series of levee breaches, which the first couple were repaired. And then in 1938, another one happened and people just sort of gave up and walked away. But once they walked away, because they had harvested peat from out of there, because it had subsided, it was at a deeper level. And so now it was a shallow lake about, between 4 and 7 feet deep. And so nobody really knew what to do with this. In the 1950s, it became a Navy bombing target to do practice air runs, and then eventually became a state park in 1959, which it still is to this day, which you're seeing in the bottom there. And that little, so it's still this open, tidally influenced lake, and the little dots you see there are the grid of hunting blind reservations that the parks administers out there. So this is what it looks like from Bethel Island, which is an urbanized community adjacent to it. And this gives you a sense of scale of Frank's Tract. You're looking out into that lake. And what you see is that you see those little remnant strips of land. Those were the levees that used to hold all that as land behind there before it inundated. And now those are sort of protect all those boating housing behind it, and has these passageways through it. There are a bunch of marinas out there. This is one of them. There are over 100 professional bass tournaments out here a year. It is one of the premier bass fishery. It is a highly prized recreational landscape. This is these are some hunters out with their blind in late fall. And there they are with their ducks. Very much a water-based recreational thing that's used on a regional scale. There's a lot of people even from the Bay come here. They have their boats here and they come out here to boat. So it has a very prized recreational value. But for the state, it's kind of a problem, and particularly for Department of Water Resources. What you're seeing on the left is a hydrodynamic model showing salinity coming into the tract, which you can see the shape there, and that's called the nozzle, where again, this is tidally influenced all the way from the bay. So the tide comes in here, and once it hits this open water, it just sort of stays in there and gets saltier. And the reason this is a problem is there's various places where fresh water is taken in, whether that's in Delta, and then there's also, this is the Clifton Court forebay. So this little passage here is what leads to the export pumps. So if the water's salty, it can't be exported because it really has no value, at least at this point in time. So the state is really trying to figure out how do we not have that salinity problem or keep it from coming in there. So in 2017, they partnered with California Department of Fish and Wildlife and came up with a potential solution, which you're looking here at the very northwest part of the tract. And what they were going to do was create this earthen plug right up basically where you see that nozzle come in, and basically stop it from coming into the tract. And as you also know, many probably know, there's a kind of ecological crisis in the Delta. We lost 98% of all the tidal wetland habitat that used to be there through reclamation. So this was a multifunctional project where you create about 1,000 acres of wetland. You'd also be stopping the salinity at the same time. So like a green infrastructure solution. They modeled this. It actually seemed to do quite well. But the problem was this was kind of done in a vacuum, and it was done without any stakeholder input or anything like that. And so the scenario, well, I'll back up a slide. I'm going to show you a view. This view is from right about here where these marinas are looking out. So again, all this boating community here really uses the open water and highly values it. And that proposal would basically just fill all this in. Probably would have put all the marinas out of business. the local community pretty uniformly was in opposition to this solution, because they felt it was going to really wreck things for them and they hadn't been consulted. So this is sort of where I came into this project and was really keen to ask people, do you have any suggestions, for how we might deal with this problem, or what do we do? And so we had a survey that we launched, and we had about 450 people fill this in. And this is just a small selection of some of the responses we had, but really, the dominant paradigm or dominant response was, don't change anything. We like it the way it is. We don't want anything to change. So I have pages of these kinds of responses I could show you, but really some of this I think was in reaction to not, to some of the change that had been imposed on them. But we also heard from other residents who had a slightly different opinion, which, saying regarding leave it alone, this is not really a valid position. If nothing is done, the area is going to change in ways hurting many residents. So we also were hearing this, that things were changing outside of intentions or what we're doing, again, because of salinity, because of some of the invasive weeds and things like that. So we kind of started over, and that's where the project started to be called Frank's Track Futures, and started to do a more public co-design process, a scenario planning process with the public. And to kick off, we started to build a different baseline of, what is this landscape, and really built that around what users thought of it. And so this was a geospatial survey where you could take your phone or, a computer station and input, like, what are your regular boating routes in and throughout the tract? You can see each one of those lines was imported by somebody taking this survey. And you can see, the marinas are a big point where people go, and they, just sort of zoom across the tract. We asked them, where could marsh potentially be located that wouldn't bother you? We asked a lot of demographic information. We asked where you recreate and what kind of things you do. And you can see there's a wide diversity spread across the entire tract. We asked them, where do you launch your boat, or where is public access needed? But I think one of the most important questions we asked them is, what are the areas of the tract that most need improvement? If you remember a few slides back, people said they don't want anything to change. But once, this was repositioned of like, well, what could be done that might, improve your life? And we got a lot of responses, people really not liking all of the aquatic weeds, people wanting, worried about some of the boating hazards that were like submerged old levees and things like that. And there was actually a lot of things that people said they wanted. They wanted more beaches, which had eroded away. They wanted more levee protection. So this really became an opening to thinking about the future in a different way. And so basically we pretty expansively redid the goals for the project. This sort of middle goal of community in place was missing in the first round, to really try to maintain and enhance recreation, to support navigation, and really try to help the local economy rather than kill it. And this was originally a Delta smelt research project, and there was a lot of pushback about that, about other species, about sports fishing, and about birds. And so really a more synthetic notion of the ecology of the place, and how do you try to benefit multiple species, along with the water quality, salinity prevention, which was a real need for the state. So these sort of became the new overall goals for the project. And we really did not know whether or not this was possible. So we started about a 1.5 year long, I would say, participatory scenario co-design process. We had a public meeting, and that's where we launched that survey. And that's where a lot of people had to get a lot of frustration off their chest before we could proceed, based on the process that had happened before. And then we started doing these workshops where we would come together with a lot of the stakeholders and the agencies to look at different scenarios. What this diagram is showing, we initially came with 7, which were 6 different possible scenarios for how you might try to mass land in here. Some of them meeting project objectives, some of them not, while also doing a no action alternative, because a lot of people wanted nothing to happen. And so we always kept that as a comparison, what would happen if you do nothing versus one of the scenarios. So out of this, we asked people to select, which ones seem most promising to you. And you see the 1 and 2 were the top choices. And then the third one was a combination of 2 of the other scenarios. And so those 3 plus the no action was basically what we carried forward in 3 iterations of those scenarios. trying to refine each scenario as we went through according to all these different parameters, which was, we had our ecology experts, we had our recreational consultants, we had the fish biology people, and then we had hydro modeling engineering folks to, test all of these scenarios out, and the residents and users. So, and just to give you an idea, these look like these blobs, but there was really a lot of rigor in how these took shape. Again, according to all these different parameters, right? You were trying to meet all of them. And this is just a diagram kind of talking about, where could you combine landforms that wasn't going to impact boating? Where could you put beaches that actually work for the community and based on wind direction so that they're actually, of use to the community? Where might you try to locate riparian habitat for fish? So there was all these different things that were molding these landforms along each iteration that were then tested through some of the, physical science parameters. I'd say most of the actual productive work was this kind of face-to-face interaction where, these are some of the team members, some of the state agencies, and a lot of the locals getting together in one room. This is actually on a boat in the Delta where we met, and really just, having those scenarios there and people to be able to give feedback on them and what worked and what didn't work and having these conversations. And I think this is really where the co-learning and the adaptation kind of, for me, was one of the most poignant moments. And I'll pause on this one for a second. This is Eli Ateljevich, and he's one of the lead hydrodynamic modelers from DWR. And you see him here, he's got his hands full because he's explaining his hydrodynamic run results to the local community here. And you can see the one person, with his hands in the air, it's a resident asking him questions about it. And so Eli had to figure out how to explain this really complex modeling to the community, and the community would have questions and sort of some ground truthing of some of the assumptions in the modeling. So I think both sides were learning from this, and this was a lot of what these meetings were, so that over time, it was sort of, I'd say, some really advanced collective intelligence that the group built from these meetings. And again, it was really the people involved that made this project happen. This was the steering committee, which was all of the senior agencies, mainly responsible decision-making or making this go forward should a design come about. I'm sorry, I don't have time to go through all these people, but you get the idea. And then we had an advisory committee, and these were all the people who had been left out before, who had who could be impacted by this or benefit from it if it was done in the right way. And so these were a lot of the marina operators, the local reclamation districts, some of the sport fishing agencies and so forth, that also came to these workshops, and we all worked together to try to refine the different scenarios. For things like this is one of the marina operators and some of the state park folks, and they are basically reviewing a lot of recreational components within the different scenarios and placement and types of features that some UC Davis students had put together. And, these were something that had to be done as part of the project to make it so that the community would buy into this kind of scenario, because otherwise they were just negatively impacted. But how could the project actually build community value? So this is showing, how we got feedback on those scenarios with some of these sheets of like, are these features working? Are there things that you want in them? And aesthetics were really important. They really thought this was just going to be a giant mud flat out there. They really didn't want that. So we were asking people, like, what is an attractive landscape to you and what is acceptable? And so we did like visual aesthetic things with them as well. And so what we ended up with were the no action scenario and basically 3 designs that worked actually met the project goals that the state was looking for in terms of ecology and salinity attenuation, as well as meeting local interests. And so we had these 3 that all surprisingly worked. And what you see here is basically, you can see these masses of earth, which would be basically tidal wetlands made from scooping material out of the other parts of the tract and stacking it up. And that had another benefit, because where you go deeper, you actually get rid of all the aquatic weeds, because you go down deep enough, they don't take purchase. So create open water and then these land masses. So basically a giant cut and fill operation. And you can see the barrier shifts from being in the top one up towards the north to a design that kind of splits the tract in two, to one that pushes it as far away from the community as you can in the eastern landmass. So we had these three. And then the idea was we were going to take all of these and have a public meeting. We hit the COVID lockdown, and so we had to move everything into online format. So we did a webinar, and then we launched another survey, another geospatial survey, and where people could go in and go through these fly-throughs and see each design, and then they could put their questions into them and say their likes and dislikes. So this is just from one of the three scenarios, and you see on the left all the feedback in terms of likes, things like, yeah, I like where that is, I don't like, I like how this is and whatnot. And then on the right, the dislikes, or where people question things. So just to give you a sense of the level of feedback we got from these when they went to a vote. And to my surprise, this was the preferred design scenario, the one in the mass in the middle that basically split the tract in two. The community really liked this because it kept the open water in front of their community while creating this second sheltered recreational pool of water on the other side. It also had the least impact in terms of boating through the tract. So I think, the most important thing in terms of the outcome I thought from this project was when we started, again, everybody said, don't do anything. At the end, most people voted for one of the three designs, and a much smaller portion actually wanted to keep it as it was. So there was an actual shift and an actual change and a willingness to perhaps think about adapting and doing something about some of these needs. Part of the project was we had a consultant, Compass, who does structured decision making. We were kind of meshing that with this scenario planning process. And so again, we came up with the 7 project objectives as a group collectively, but then we had to look at all these ways of measuring this. So we had to come up with qualitative and quantitative ways of assessing performance. And so just to call out a few things, one of them was the channel size, because the community wants wide channels for boating, but if you make them too wide, you lose the salinity benefit, right? Because the water gets through. So you had to find the sweet spot. And this turned out to be about a 100-meter wide channel, which gave enough room for boaters to, get through while also working hydrodynamically. We still got the salinity benefit. These are outputs from Eli's and his team's work. And it's showing basically we got really lucky. The one with the landmass in the middle actually worked the best in terms of salinity attenuation. It was also the preferred one for the community. That was totally luck. And you can see here, this is also looking at velocity. It actually improved some of the velocity in areas. You don't want it too high because it's hard for boating. A little bit of velocity is nice because it scours out the channels. Again, I'm just showing you can't take this all in right now, but these are some of the things we looked at, like how it impacted navigation in terms of boat. Any solution we put in there was going to change how long it took to get where you were wanting to go. So we looked at the impact of that. We had all these other parameters for recreation, whether it was motorized, non-motorized boating, what kind of features were being created, hunting, and so forth. These were, again, all had to be assessed. And these are just some of the renderings of those features, such as new beaches and day use areas, sheltered coves and mooring areas, new diversified hunting opportunities, and the tidal marsh channels, which had a recreational value and were also, of course, really designed for the ecological value. And so again, just another quick look under the hood. This was just looking into all of the different parameters that were set for the ecological benefits as you try to diversify the habitats within this tract through the intervention. So I don't have time to go through all of these, but just trying to give you a sense of the depth that we went to try to measure how these things would work. So that's one example of a participatory scenario planning model, sort of at a contained scale with a very kind of clear notion of like what the normative or preferred goals for the project was. And sort of shifting gears a little bit, the work I'm starting now with a bunch of others, this is somewhat built off of the Frank's Track Futures work, and is also really looking at what what our future options might be for managing salinity. This is a UC multi-campus grant called Just Transitions in Large Socio-Ecological Systems, Drought, Sea Level Rise, and Salinity in the Delta. And basically, I see this as a very scaled up, broader participatory scenario planning project than what Frank's Track Futures was, where looking at a wider range of potential management options, also a much more stakeholder engagement at the outset of actually thinking like what types of futures and scenarios do they want the team to test. So the stakeholders will drive what sort of things are looked at in trying to involve some of those who don't normally have a voice in these things. So showing these, I think with any scenario planning process you engage in, it's really important to think about what are the scales you're looking at, both in space and time. I just look, I showed the Frank's Track Futures, which was at a very specific scale, but there's just so many ways the Delta has changed over time and the ways that we have changed it. And the scale at which you look at, that kind of really determines what kinds of scenarios you run and what your expectations are. And again, this one really jumps up in scale from Frank's Tract. And this is a diagram showing our proposed process. This is from our proposal, where again, we're going to start with a very intensive stakeholder outreach and interviews to really ask stakeholders, what do you think are the primary drivers of salinity intrusion, and what kind of scenarios would you like to see run? What kinds of, techniques to prevent or to attenuate salinity management would you like? And how do you think decision-making should happen around that? And so from that, we will try to craft a first set of scenarios and then come back to all those stakeholders and have them vetted against, kind of like Frank's Tract, over 3 iterations of refining them and testing them with, we have a very diverse team of expertise from ecologists, climate modelers, and all those that will then vet these as we go across. And this is just sort of some internal work we've done as a team to really start to take stock of, what are the drivers of change, how we group them into certain things to really play out some scenarios. But again, these are questions we will ask stakeholders and experts to revise and change these as we go along. And I think one piece of nomenclature from scenario planning that might be really helpful is the difference between exploratory scenarios and normative scenarios. Normative scenarios are very much like Frank's Tract, where you are basically taking the values we have now as we know them and projecting them into the future. We know we want to keep salinity at bay if we can. We know we want to improve these ecological habitats. We know we want to have these communities do better than they might otherwise. So it's taking those values and trying to think about what kind of futures you might make. Exploratory scenarios are a little bit more what might happen without the normative aspect. Like, I think we mostly have gotten used to these in terms of climate change predictions or forecasts of just what could happen and thinking across that. And this project, I think, will be going back and forth between both of those, of really taking in some of the science and some of the climate change predictions or things like that, and trying to test them against a set of normative scenarios of what people and stakeholders might want to see in the future. So again, a broader range of things for potential consideration than in the Frank's Tract Futures project. Frank's Tract really was under this first one, like a landscape or nature-based solution, basically a marsh restoration project. But also on the table are sort of the traditional or hard engineering options, such as temporary salinity barriers, which is sort of what Frank's Tract was trying to replace, or operable salinity gates, or conveyance infrastructure, which I'm sure everyone's familiar. There's a lot of talk around that right now of what's going to happen around conveyance. Possible regulatory or policy changes around water, such as reform and water rights, indigenous sovereignty, and maybe demand export reduction. And then there's another category here of we don't know what we're going to hear from all the people we reach out to and what things might be on there. So this is all provisional and early. We don't really know what the outcomes are going to be. And this, again, will be built off of trying to get a representation across a wide range of stakeholders and to sort of have them think what the priorities might be of what to test, to really try to inform future decision making of what might be possible and what are the different impacts to different stakeholders based on different scenarios that might play out, and to really try to open that decision space. So what am I doing on time? I think I'm slightly under 30. I didn't mean to show that one too much. That's it.
That was terrific, Brett. Thank you so much for sharing all of those great examples and insights from Frank's Tract and the Just Transitions Project, getting us, some insights on where that's going as well. So we're going to open it up to the ISB members first for some questions, and I see hands popping up, so this is great. And then we'll also hopefully have some time for the members of the public to ask you questions as well. So
okay, real quick, do you want me to keep sharing my screen, or is that okay? Or I guess it's probably helpful if I need to go through slides. But
yeah, we can leave it up, and if people just want to talk, we can always take them down. Okay, let's go to Tom first.
Great talk. I really appreciated the insights you were giving. My question concerns probably what is the deepest of the uncertainty, which is the Delta Conveyance Project. And it looks like you're considering it, but it seems to me that it almost drives everything, because the salinity problem becomes a very different problem with the conveyance structure, whatever form it takes. Could you say a little bit more about how you're prioritizing things? And am I right in assuming the conveyance structure becomes really important?
I think so. I guess this is my personal opinion here a little bit. I think it's a very valuable scenario to play out for what we might learn from it. Knowing that we're not promoting it, we're not saying it might happen, but to really explore what are the implications if we were to invest in if the state were to invest in a tunnel, or whatever that is. That is a huge investment. What are the implications? Who does it impact, and all of that? And so for us, that would only be just one scenario that would provide us some information of how does that compare to other scenarios or other things that would happen. But I think if I'm understanding what you're saying too, like there is a whole logic that goes along with that, and a whole set of implications that happens if that route is taken. And that's where I think the value of exploring a wide range of possible what might happen in the future is helpful, because you can start to see what that one implies versus maybe a different one.
Yeah, it's sort of the gorilla in the room, though.
Agreed. The Frank's Tract Futures Project, it was the gorilla in the room too. It was always like we had to get acknowledge that was there, because that was always like a phantom that was like, oh, this is all about the tunnels, and everybody thought we were going to take all the tunnel muck and put it in the Frank's Tract. And I think it's been lurking for 3 decades of what conveyance is going to be. Yeah, I don't think it can be ignored.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Lisa, go ahead.
Hi, Brett. Thanks for that great talk. Very interesting stuff you have going on. So I'm thinking about that grid of outcomes that comes out of the structured decision-making process. I'm wondering, did the stakeholders have questions about how your confidence in those outcomes? And even if they yes or no to that question, how did you handle variability of outcomes with the modeling? Did you try to represent that?
I would say, the variability, like the amount of indeterminacy really varied by the variable. When it was some of the recreational stuff, that was pretty easy to quantify. Like if you're creating these beaches, if you're creating these open pools, these things that we got really clear feedback of what had value or not from the community. But some of the the modeling and the uncertainty of what rate sea level rise is going to happen, and sort of like there's, I guess, a bigger question, like how long could Frank's Tract actually be viable for what it's going to do, depending on how much sea level rise, right? Which gets into all these questions, like, any wetland you build, how long will it live? And nobody knows. It all depends on the rates of which it happened, or how much action we take to curb emissions and things like that. So I'm not really answering the question very well. I think, I think we were open about it when we didn't, of saying like, this is what is known, this is what's not known. And while trying to, wherever we could, doing that, but there was definitely different levels of what could be known with any surety and what wasn't. And I think that is mostly acknowledged and somewhat put forward in the final report.
Thanks. I mean, did the stakeholders feel at all uncomfortable with that variability, or did they accept what you showed them as the most likely outcome?
I think everybody was slightly uncomfortable with the unknowability. It's part of what is, right? I mean, even, same with us. I think some of like the longer time things of how long things could last or how long the benefit were, that there was some uncomfortability about that. I think we had more surety about what might happen in the near term, but as it got further out, there was more uncertainty. And I think a lot of people were more interested in like what's going to happen for the next 10 or 15 years. So that was where maybe some of that focus went. But yeah, it's a really good question.
Okay, thanks, Brett.
Obey, you're up.
Hey, Brett, thank you. Really great presentation. Really interested to find out how the stakeholders themselves change sort of their attitude towards the solution. But I do have two questions. So if you do nothing, I mean, the saltwater salinity intrusion is a non-stationary problem. In other words, there's a time dimension to it. And I was curious, when you work with the stakeholders, was there any opportunity to think about using dynamically adaptive pathways in the solution, and how the stakeholders would look at that? In other words, your solution becomes, the solution evolves as the conditions change, and you hit some tipping points. And was there any opportunity you had, or it seems like in the Frank's Tract stage at least? That's my question. I'll ask the other question as well. So in the participatory process you had, particularly when you look at explorative scenarios, if I can say that, I was curious, was there any situation where the stakeholders didn't want to beyond the normal boundaries of what could happen in the long run? So those are two questions I'm asking. The opportunity to use the dynamic adaptive pathway strategy, and then sort of the scenario boundaries where they would be comfortable thinking about.
I would say, the Frank's Tract features was, I'd say, as a scenario planning project, was fairly tightly bound. We couldn't assume any kind of changes in exports or things like that, and that came up with a lot of stakeholders, like, why don't you just taking out so much water, then we won't have this problem. We're like, this project, as it's beyond the boundaries of what we can look at. So there were sort of like constraints and boundaries that were put in place for what we were looking at, versus if you look at I would say the Just Transitions project removes a lot of those, and it's a wider range of what is. Regarding your other one, I guess I'm curious, like, if you saw the process, like, is there ways that you think that would be done in this project of how we
there could be what I thought was your scenarios could have a time dimension. Let's say 20 years from now, this is how it would change, and eventually this would be that ultimate stable solution for, let's say, 100 years.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a temporal dimension to your scenario discussion with the stakeholders. That could have been what I thought could be possible to implement or convince the stakeholders about the dynamic adaptive pathway strategy. I don't know, just thinking. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
Diane.
Okay, so this in a way is following up on Obe's question. In the case of Frank's track, to what extent was the participation motivated by a sense, well, this could actually happen? Whereas my impression at the larger scale in the Delta, there's been lots of talk over decades about what to do, and there may be some sense of a larger scale inertia that there's talk, but nothing's going to happen. Do you see what I'm saying? We were talking about the conveyance infrastructure's been on the books and designed one way or another, but it hasn't happened.
Yeah, I think I get your question, and like, I mean, basically, like we went from a place of conflict and having no like agreement on what to do, to spending a year and a half with a lot of people investing a lot of time, and actually came up with something that everybody was really excited about. And it's 3 years later, and there's like really nothing happening. Is that kind of what you mean?
Well, but maybe the people involved in Frank's track thought that something would actually happen, right?
Yes.
Yes. Whereas at the larger scale of given all the problems that have been acknowledged but not addressed, it may be even harder to get people to believe that something might happen.
Yeah, I mean, the Delta is full of these, right? Like all these projects that sometimes take, 30, 40 years to happen, or I mean, conveyance hasn't happened in 50 years. And, there's all these other things. Again, I guess that's part of the indeterminacy in the Delta, right? It's very hard, and it's very hard to know which projects will actually go forward. It's another layer of, I think, we're talking a lot in this particular one about social and political and governance indeterminacies of, there's a lot of them, and there's a lot in the Delta of what's actually going to get funded. It's an extremely expensive project. And I think that's part of it, is like, how would that be creatively funded across different agencies and things like that, which that's a whole other level of adaptation that needs to happen of, how these projects get funded, and, especially when it's mutual benefit across a wide range of agencies and things like that. Like it's not built that way. So I guess I think I get what you're saying. I feel the same way, that there's a lot of these projects that get worked on, and you don't know what's gonna, even if they prove like supported and viable, you don't know what's going to happen with them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Great talk.
Bob, jump in.
Well, that was a great talk, Brad. I agree. And I'm really curious about to what level costs were considered in these discussions and developing these scenarios. And not just the costs of actually doing them over a reasonable period of time, but also the long-term maintenance costs of kind of, once the habitat or the landscape is sculpted in the way that folks would like to see it, there are real costs associated with that, both monetary costs and social costs. And I was very curious about if that was even discussed, or at what level it was considered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a big concern. That was a big concern, with the park districts, and we had East Bay parks and state parks on the project, and also with the community, because they want the levee protection and things like that, and what would happen over time. So there's some of that in the final report that came out. Again, I guess I should situate this too. Like, this was a first pass It was sort of like a feasibility study to even see if this was possible. And then the idea was that there was going to be more follow-up EIR kind of planning and things that would happen. So that was, I think, a very important concern of like what kind of maintenance would happen here, particularly like some of the recreational features and making sure that those would have some sort of budget for them, and all of that. So it was a consideration. It was, I guess, in some ways moved into like, if there's a follow-up planning, if this is actually going to go towards implementation, there was then going to be subsequent steps that would really flesh that out in more detail. But it was definitely, I would say, from the agency side and from the stakeholder side, a strong concern.
Oh, that's very nice to hear. Anyway, thank you, Brett.
Virginia?
So I want to follow up on Bob's question, because this was a really good talk, but Bob hit on something I was wondering about too. And that is because when I've done projects like this, we kind of start with what we call indicators, things like the different kinds of costs that people have and so forth, and then move ahead to the futures. But it sounds like you're putting those toward the end, and that's just different perspectives. Did you ask people the details about what, I guess the way I'm going to put it is what kind of things they would care about? Like, you showed a lot of pictures of recreation, but they have different costs and benefits and ways you would regulate things. So did you ask people? I guess what I'm asking is what they value in terms of, costs is one word, but it might be, attributes of the systems.
I think we definitely asked people what they wanted. I would say it was probably less framed from a cost point of view.
Yeah, but
the primary thing,
yeah, if they want open water, what is it, the attributes of the open water? That's a little different because you can get there in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they wanted open water. They also wanted it to actually be open water because it's full of weeds. It's really hard to boat across. But then there are other stakeholders who really think that's prime bass habitat and they don't want it cleaned out. So there was really different ideas sometimes of what people wanted. But I think I understand the question. I mean, it wasn't, when we were doing it, there's definitely compromises in this project and how it started and how we tried to like pull it into a different direction. And it really was, saying like, well, these are some of the things that the state is really hoping to try to fix. And we know these things are impacting you. What would you like to see, or how could this be something that you could get on board with? Is there a way that this could be beneficial to you? And when we started, it really was a feasibility study. We didn't know if those community demands could actually still make the actual salinity prevention and all of that work. So it, in some ways, I guess I would say it was very like just testing to see if it was possible. And then, there was a general idea of like what a limited amount of cost would be. I think it's probably a little bit more than what was hoped for. But there's, were many talks of like, okay, well, how could this be streamlined back or things like that? But I'm not sure if that actually gets at the question you meant, but
yeah, I guess I'm trying to say, I don't know how to say it very well. Maybe an example, you could ask people, do they want clean water? Or you could say, do you want water without, particulates in it? Do you want water without chemicals in it? Do you want water that, that you can easily move through? All of those are clean water in some measures. So did you let them come up with the more general characteristics, or did you ask them more specific things that could be measurable? Or did you let them just come up with it? It sounds like.
Yeah, I think we really, said, what do you see as like the future you want, or, what are the things that are important to you? Definitely they didn't like most of them do not, from that I talked to, did not want salinity to happen either. They just didn't want it to be prevented in the method it was going to be. They didn't like seeing sharks. I mean, we could really sit down and chat about this. It was just hours of information of like what, different things that people wanted. And then we, sort of like doing these interviews, looked for commonalities and things that people were saying, and then tried to, push them, make different scenarios or the scenarios respond to those things. But,
Well, you're right. It'd probably take hours of discussion,
mhm.
but you've done hours already, clearly. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we might have a question from a member of the public. Edmund, is that correct?
Yes, we have a public question from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre will give you the ability to unmute your microphone. But as a reminder, if anyone here has, looks like there wasn't a public question, it's lowered. But we do have one from Brett Harvey. Brett Harvey, please, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. And if before you provide your question, feel free to briefly introduce yourself.
First of all, can you hear me? Okay, I'm Brett Harvey. I met Brett way back before this stuff happened, and we were thinking about ways to try and do research on this and these kind of processes. And I think so that my question relates to that. But first, I just wanted to sort of dream a little bit and say, hey, okay, how are you going to scale this up to in an international level and address climate change issues? Because I'm so interested in the learning aspect of this and the trust building aspect of it. And so with regard to that, I was just wondering, like, just from a social scientist, like your social scientist hat, what did you learn anything about people or about the effectiveness of these kind of processes and how you could improve that? Because I know that's like a big part of what you think about. At least I think it is. Is that too much talking and an unclear question?
No, it's good to hear you. Can you just say your question again for me one more time?
So did you learn anything about these kind of processes in general that you would carry forward to improve these kind of processes in the future? Was there anything surprising or?
I don't know. My general takeaway is actually really, really simple. And it also happened with like a drought paper I did with a bunch of people years back. And it really is about people just getting in the same room. It sounds really simple, but there is like just the interpersonal exchange and actually doing that and those kinds of workshops and things. I find that is where I tried to highlight that in the presentation a little bit. Like, I feel like those were always when like the big moves happened or some sort of surprising outcome would come about, or just people having eating lunch together over it. And you have like, folks who are usually at odds with each other in their roles that they're supposed to have, but in an informal environment, something else happens. So a lot of it, I think, is just trying to craft some of those situations where people can have that kind of communication. So it's incredibly simple as a takeaway, but that's one of them. I'd have to think about what some of my other ones might be.
I think that's a good especially for scientists and engineers. Like, we are animals too, and we have the way we interact,
it's
so
that
social.
too, right? It's very experiential and aesthetic. Like, I feel like that is often not foregrounded in any of this, and it really is one's experience that matters, and sort of validation of one experience and validation of somebody else's. So yeah, it's also fun, but I don't know.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. We have another public question, but feel free to comment first. Okay.
Oh, please, you're on mute. Let's go ahead. I think it's Deirdre. Right?
Yeah, it's Deirdre Desjardins. And I wanted to ask Brett, what would it take to get academic researchers such as yourself to model a scenario that fishing and environmental and Delta groups have asked for, which is operating reservoirs to meet water quality control plan requirements in an extended drought? and maybe reducing exports and trying critically dry rivers.
Thank you. So the question was, what would it take to
Yeah, to get academic researchers to do that, because I know you went into this and had a very constrained set of priorities, but that's been sort of the issue with all of the climate adaptation planning in the Delta is the preferred alternative is providing flows to meet water quality objective for drought adaptation in the Delta, and salinity intrusion is carrying over enough water in the reservoirs so that the in-basin needs can be met. And potentially means reducing exports and taking less risk with reservoir carryover storage.
I mean, I would say that with the Just Transition Project, those are the kinds of ideas that we hope to vet with stakeholders. And, you know, our hope is to get as wide a range of ideas as people have to start with, and then sort of from that, bring those back to everyone and see, you know, which ones do, you know, we find that a lot of people have interest in doing, and maybe that haven't been, you know, tested or thought through. So I think what you're talking about are definitely things that we're thinking about for that research project, and you are on my list to hopefully talk to.
Thank you.
So.
Well, I'm wondering, because it has been literally since 2012. We've been advocating for this since we saw with 18 inches of sea level rise what was going to happen to reservoirs and with the increased outflow. And would we have to get buy-in from like MWD or other South of Delta water users or DWR? Because that's been the issue, is everything's done from this framework of power, and the power players won't agree to that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I that is what our goal is to try to give voice to things that maybe haven't been, and to really provide a diverse range of potential things to think about for the future. So, yeah.
I think my thought is that it actually might be beneficial to, for example, permanent crop growers in the San Joaquin Valley, or you know, small towns that are dependent upon water exports for drinking water. But for large water agencies like MWD MWD has Diamond Valley, and they just take water south aggressively and put it in Diamond Valley, and it's optimal for them, but it's not for other users and for the environment. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. I think that was a good comment to end on, and gives you some food for thought there, Brett, as you're working on the Just Transitions project, and best of luck with that. And hopefully we'll keep tabs on how that's going, and you know, look to us for advice, I guess, if there are questions. So let's thank Brett for a great presentation, and let him get back to his important work. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all. Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.